This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast.
Well, let's get down to some of the research here. So this was written way back in 1948, and what he was saying back then, this is Edwin H. Colbert writing in the Bulletin of the Geological Society of America, and what he was saying back then in 1948 is still true today. And this is what he said. This was appeared in the Bulletin of the Geological Society of America, Volume 59, 1948, Pleistocene of the Great Plains. He says the Pleistocene period is a geological time unit of great interest to students of the earth sciences, not only because of the unusual sequence of glacial advances and retreats that took place during its extent, but also because it is the most recent of the defined geologic periods, the period closest to us in time, the period in which our own immediate ancestors had their origin and went through much of their development. Yet, in spite of the great amount of work that has been devoted to the study of Pleistocene history, there is still much that remains to be done. Many problems are unsolved. While for many more problems, only partial solutions have been reached. Among the many problems of Pleistocene history are those of the defining boundaries for the beginning and for the end of the period. Both of these boundaries are difficult to establish. There is the question, which is of course in part academic, as to whether we are actually out of the Pleistocene period as yet. Perhaps we are not. Perhaps we are still living in an interglacial interval that at some future date will be followed by another period of refrigeration and glacial advance. So the questions that he raised way back in 1948, right, which is what, 60, 70 years ago now? Those are still valid questions that haven't been answered. You see, is this epoch that we call the Holocene, the whole of the recent, the last, generally in rough terms given as 10,000 years, but more precisely now, since that was written, we do have a much more precise boundary for the end of it, right? And that's the boundary at 11,600. That is the Younger-Dryas pre-boreal boundary, dated 11,600 BP before present, right? This is the date we've been throwing back and forth and around since we started this series of podcasts. We've shown this date in connection with Plato's Atlantis, right? So the beginning of the Younger-Dryas, 12,000 in round numbers, we'll say 12,900. So we basically have a 1,300-year period that constitutes the transition out of the previous Pleistocene into the Holocene. Is the Holocene really just a temporary interval within the Pleistocene? Now, to the extent that we've been able to reconstruct past climates of the Pleistocene, we find periods that appear to be analogous to the Holocene, and yet, compared to the Holocene, they're generally much shorter. The Eemian maybe is about the same length of time. The Eemian is about 105 to 120,000 years ago, somewhere like in that range, right? But as it turns out, even within the Eemian now, it's appeared that no, that period of 12 or 15,000 years was far from being stable, and not as stable as the Holocene. The Holocene, out of the last 250,000 years, has actually been remarkably stable, and that might be one reason why we've been able to create this civilization that we now are inhabiting, that is allowing you guys to sit there in Texas, Brad up there in North Carolina, and me here in Georgia, and to carry on like this using this technology, without which, had there not been an industrial revolution or a scientific revolution, none of this would have been happening. If there hadn't been a period of stable agricultural development, none of that would have happened, see? And if the climate was like it was during the Pleistocene, maybe that agricultural foundation wouldn't have happened. See, so these are all questions. We cannot take any of this for granted. That's the point. And we've kind of gotten into this idea now that we're in the driver's seat. And
Nope.
this is a folly. If we believe we are in the driver's seat, and because we are in the driver's seat, we're now ignoring these other factors that at this point have not been really identified yet. Well, we might really find ourselves in a very vulnerable position. Whereas we need to be looking at the whole equation of global change. And in order to do that, we have to look at the big picture. We have to go back to the Pleistocene. And he was talking about the beginning of the Pleistocene, the beginning of the boundary, which for a long time was placed at 1.6 million, has now been pushed back to about 2.6 million years. And what differentiates the Pleistocene from the previous epoch, which was the Pliocene, was the beginning of this oscillation between glacial interglacial ages. And so we are now, basically in the position where the Holocene that we're in now is as long in duration as any previous interglacial epoch we've been able to identify in the last 250,000 years. So what does this suggest? Should we just assume it's going to go on like this forever? I would say not. And so anyways, let's continue on here. This would be more recent. We're going to jump forward to 1991. This is Anthony J. Stewart writing in Biology Review, Mammalian Extinctions in the Late Pleistocene of Northern Eurasia and North America. In the very recent geological past, until shortly before the end of the Pleistocene period, and in parentheses, he's got 10,000 radiocarbon years before present. Now, I'll mention here that when you say radiocarbon years, these are going to be different than calendar years, because generally through calibration, through a number of different techniques, you have to add, when you get back that far, you have to add a couple of thousand years to radiocarbon years to get calendar years. Okay, you follow that? So when you see 10,000 radiocarbon years, you need to be thinking something more along the lines of 12,000 calendar years. Okay, so in the very recent geological past, until shortly before the end of the Pleistocene period, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and giant deer were part of the fauna of Europe and northern Asia, while mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats occurred in North America. South America was home to mastodons, giant ground sloths, litopterns, which I believe are rabbit-like. You could look that up for me, Kyle. LITO, litopterns. And glyptodonts. Okay, glyptodonts are armadillo-like animals. And Australia, largely isolated from the rest of the world since the beginning of the Cenozoic, supported a range of giant marsupials. However, by the Pleistocene-Holocene boundary, conventionally placed at 10,000 radiocarbon years before present, these and many other terrestrial mammals had disappeared, mostly without replacement by evolution or immigration, leaving the relatively impoverished faunas that we see today. Only in Africa and southern Asia did elephants, rhinoceroses, and the majority of other large animals known from the late Pleistocene manage to survive to the present day. That's an interesting point, right? So Africa and southern Asia were able to preserve their large late Pleistocene megafauna. What does that suggest about the nature of the catastrophe that engulfed the planet? It suggests that in certain areas, you could think of they were somewhat sheltered from the adverse conditions that wiped out the other animals. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't mass mortality events in Africa. or South Asia. But what that suggests is that there was enough survivors that they replenished the population. You see, in the whole species, because in order for the whole species to go extinct, you're essentially having to eliminate every single breeding pair virtually, right?
To kill them all. Yes.
You have to kill them all. And I always used to cite the example of the American bison, which was reduced to maybe 100 or 200 individuals around the turn of the century. Now look how quickly it's rebounded. Obviously there's no danger of the American bison going extinct when you can walk into the supermarket and buy bison burger, right? So the thing is that if we were looking from the vantage point of 10,000 years in the future, we could completely miss the fact that the American bison became within a hair's breadth of extinction, total extinction, right? We might miss that completely, especially because of the fact that there are not the great remains, the boneyards and the deposits of mass death that we find associated with Pleistocene megafauna. So we could completely miss that, right? In the same way we could miss the near extinction of the human species. And I think maybe we did. In one of the comments, it was a critical comment saying, well, we know that there was a genetic bottleneck around 74,000 years ago, which was probably the result of the super eruption of the volcano Toba, right? Which we're going to talk about too when we get into talking about volcanoes. But they said there's no evidence of a genetic bottleneck equivalent at the end of the Pleistocene. The simple answer to that is, in the 73 to 74,000 year ago event, it's likely that human population was reduced to a small group isolated geographically, from which basically the whole population that followed rebounded from that one small group. I don't think we're looking at that with the Pleistocene. We're looking at widely dispersed small groups, you see, that would have preserved a considerable degree of genetic diversity. And so the genetic bottleneck doesn't really show up because you would have had survivors presumably in North America, South America, although much more limited than you might find in Eurasia or even Africa, right? In other places, you would have had more survivors. In some places, probably fewer survivors, just like the evidence suggests that there were still a few people in North America post-Pleistocene, but we see with the collapse of the Clovis culture, it appears that there was a near disappearance of all humans at that point around 12,008 to 12,900 years ago. So the lack of the evidence for a genetic bottleneck at the end of the Pleistocene doesn't necessarily mean that human population numbers weren't reduced to dangerously low numbers. Does that make sense? Then the idea that the Pleistocene megafauna survived for the large part in Africa suggests that the effects of the catastrophes were not uniformly distributed over the earth. And there had to have been places where some animals survived. I've considered one possibility is the Great Rift Valley may have been a place where humans and animals did survive in larger numbers than they did around the rest of the planet. Although, and I haven't had a really chance to digest this latest research yet, but now there's a platinum anomaly that's been discovered at the Pleistocene Holocene boundary, at the Younger-Dryas boundary in South Africa, which is certainly interesting, and I'm going to be exploring that. And when we get into talking more about the Younger-Dryas boundary, we're going to be looking at all of that. But of course, all of this ties in with that because one of the effects of those global changes was the loss of the megafauna. So Stewart goes on to say, although the disappearance at the end of the Pleistocene throughout most parts of the world of many species and genera of large terrestrial mammals appears as a major event, in perspective, it may be viewed as just the most recent of a number of episodes of mass extinction in the geological record. And yeah, we now know that mass extinction events have been, in a sense, kind of normal. When we look at, the Great Five, which is, the late Ordovician, the end-terminal Ordovician, the late Devonian, the Jurassic boundary, the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary. There was a mass extinction at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, and probably at least 24 more that weren't of the severity. A mass extinction event might knock out a quarter or a third of all species. The Great Five, we're talking about 3/4, say 75 to 95% of all species. So that's a pretty severe event, whatever can knock out 95% of all species of animals on Earth. Yeah. And these are, of course, mostly marine animals because we're looking at the Permian Triassic, which was 40 million years ago. But anyways, he goes on to say here, nevertheless, as pointed out by Paul Martin, I'm going to digress. Paul Martin was kind of even though he wasn't the originator of the idea, he was the guy back in the 1960s who made the strongest case for the Pleistocene overkill, the idea that humans were responsible for the mass extinction. We can blame that on Paul Martin, right? Now, and he's argued that position for years. I think he's recently passed away. I'm not 100% sure, but even though he argued for a cause that I don't agree with, he served a very important role because nobody else was really looking at the place he did. And he looked at it and said, yeah, it's catastrophic. Now, how can we explain it? Well, let's see. Humans came across the land bridge and immigrated to North America at the same time the megafauna went extinct. Therefore, humans were responsible. Well, there are many reasons now why that is no longer tenable. But we need to look at it anyway. And what we owe to Paul Martin is reviving the interest in the mass extinction of event when nobody else was really looking at it except, eccentrics out on the fringe. Nevertheless, as pointed out by Martin, the pattern of late Pleistocene extinctions has a unique feature. In contrast to earlier mass extinctions, for example, at the Permian Triassic and Cretaceous-Tertiary boundaries, which affected a very wide range of animals and plants, both terrestrial and marine, that of the late Pleistocene mainly affected large terrestrial mammals. Why would that be the case? Well, for one thing, it clearly shows that the extinction, the forces causing the extinction weren't as severe as, the Permian Triassic or the Cretaceous Tertiary, because it didn't wipe out, 50 or 70 or 80 or 90% of all marine species, obviously, at the end of the Pleistocene. It was largely selective towards large terrestrial mammals. Well, the explanation I don't think is too complicated there. Large terrestrial animals require a lot of habitat. They require a lot of food, right? Proboscideans are going to eat, 400 or 500 pounds of food in a day, right? They require foliage, right? They require space. They require longer times between generations, right? It might, in the larger animals, you might be looking at 6 months to 2 years between one generation and the next, okay? The longer nurturing times before the infants of the larger species can survive on their own. All of these factors are going to be directly affected by major habitat loss. You see, the food supply goes down, the collapse of the food chain. Think about the smaller animals that can reproduce quickly, scavenger animals. They're going to survive, right? Because there's going to be a lot of, if you're going to talk about, killing off 10 million woolly mammoths, that's a lot of food for scavengers to eat, right? And then you throw in all the rest of the creatures. Frank C. Hibben, the anthropologist from New Mexico, estimated perhaps 40 million megafauna individuals as a minimum succumbed. So he's pointing out that it was affected mainly large terrestrial mammals. And again, so the likely explanation for that, the most logical explanation, again, is widespread habitat loss, which then would drastically affect the food supply. And then he goes on to say, and this is certainly true, although a global phenomena, late Pleistocene extinctions were highly variable in their severity in different regions. In his review of late Pleistocene extinction for mammals exceeding 44 kilograms mean adult body weight, 44 kilograms is about 100 pounds, Martin estimates that South America lost approximately 46 out of 58 genera. Now, genera is the next taxonomic classification above species and below family, right? Australia lost, or in other words, 80%. So 46 out of 58 genera is 80% of all genera. Australia lost 15 out of 16, or 94%. North America, including Alaska and Yukon, 33 out of 45, which is 73%. And Africa, including North Africa, 7 out of 49, or 14%. So what does that suggest there? It suggests that the forces causing the demise of these animals was not as severe in Africa as it was in other parts of the world. The figure is even lower, taking Africa south of the Sahara. Only the figure is even lower, with only perhaps 2 out of 44 genera, or 5% lost. And so what we're seeing in Africa today is basically the Pleistocene megafauna that you would have seen 20,000 years ago in Africa. And pretty much everywhere else around the world, with the exception of southern India, we can see the percentages of animals that were lost. Europe suffered moderate but significant losses, with the extinction of 7 genera out of 24, or 29%. In general, the larger the animal, the more it was at risk of extinction. Most of the plausible causes for late Pleistocene extinctions were under discussion in the first half of the 19th century. Currently, there are only 2 serious contending hypotheses: man or climate. The possibility of epidemic disease does not find favor, as it has seemed unlikely that any disease would be effective both across such a wide taxonomic range and such a vast geographical area. Now, the next sentence he says is important, and I'm gonna kind of just digress into a bit of a discussion. He says, cosmic accidents, and in parentheses, asteroids, comets, etc., can be ruled out as extinctions were not globally synchronous. And that's referencing the work of Paul Martin in 1990. The debate is between those who believe extinctions resulted when animals were unable to adapt to climate changes and those who think that they were exterminated by human hunters, the hypothesis known as prehistoric overkill. So notice what he's doing. Cosmic accidents, such as asteroids and comets, can be ruled out as extinctions were not synchronous globally. So it's important to understand here that the model that he is imagining here is one single large impact, and that would then have immediate consequences globally. And if you don't have that, then it couldn't be cosmically sourced. It had to be, some terrestrial climate change, whatever that means. And again, it would imply climate change so rapid that animals couldn't adapt. And of course, we've seen from some of the ice core graphs that, there were really huge, severe swings in climate that brought the ice age to an end. But what's missing from that is, obviously, does the climate just do that on its own? Or is there something that is driving that, you see? And if there is something that's driving it, if it's not just some intrinsic mechanism within the climate itself, which we have obviously not identified, right? Then if that was the case, then that mechanism must still be something that's there as a potential, or it was something from the cosmic domain, but we're looking at something that's a little more complex than just one big rock slamming into the earth and that's it. You see? So by means of this kind of thinking, see, in a sense, this is the straw man here. You see, because what we now know, since this was written in 1991, think about what we've learned since then. Now, in 1991, nobody was actually looking and even thinking. If you suggested in 1991 that there was a cosmic accident, you would have been considered a crackpot. Even though this is now, 11 years after the discovery of the Iridium layer at the KT boundary, which really was the first thing that opened the door to the consideration of cosmic catastrophe as an agency of change in Earth history. And by 1991, the crater was just being discovered in the Yucatan when this was written.
Right.
So, basically the scientists are now saying, well, okay, in this one particular case, we'll accept it, right? But we're not going to think about that as a possibility, in terms of this most recent mass extinction event. And we will be coming back to that because we're going to really break down and analyze the Younger-Dryas. Yes, we're going to go back to Harold L. Levin, who I quoted last week, just to help give people a better picture of this world that was lost. This was The Earth Through Time, which was a geological text published in 1982. The Pleistocene was a time of splendid diversity among mammals. The fauna was probably more varied and impressive than that of Africa a century ago. The Pleistocene was an age of giants in which colossal ground sloths, beavers over 2 meters tall. That's beavers, you're talking about 6 and 7 feet tall, right? Giant dire wolves, all rangy mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses ranged far and wide across continents. And then we got into, after that, which we quoted last week, we got into a succession of images showing a lot of the Pleistocene megafauna, and to try to introduce people to these amazing creatures. But then Harold Levin goes on to say, one might think an assemblage of beasts that had proved their stamina against the difficulties of an ice age would persist for at least as long as did the dinosaurs. Yet, widespread extermination and extinction was the dominant biological theme at the end of the Pleistocene. The cause of the extinctions is unknown. Now, he was writing that in 1982, and basically that's still the case, although since 2007, with the publication of the work of James Kennett and Alan West and Richard Firestone and their colleagues, we now have in hand a lot of evidence that, yeah, it really was something cosmic. It was a cosmic accident that happened, that the esteemed Professor Stewart in his writings of 1991 was dismissive of. So let us go on. We quoted Rembrandt Peale, we quoted Alfred Russel Wallace. Then we learned something about you. Who was it? You, Russ, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Called out that name and doxed me.
Yeah. Then we quoted Charles Darwin. So now we will talk about an article that was written in 1847. I love going back to this old stuff. Sometimes it's amazing how the old stuff, some of these guys looking at these things, with completely innocent eyes for the first time anybody looks at it, are almost taking it at face value and saying, yeah, it really does look like this was a catastrophe. Yeah. Later, when you get all of the various theories and explanations that are mostly designed to steer us away from catastrophe, he's talking about, this is the American Journal of Science, 1847, the general geological distribution and probable food and climate of the mammoth. The remains of the mammoth occur on the continent, as in England, in the superficial deposits of sand, gravel, and loam, which are strewed over all parts of Europe, and they are found in still greater abundance in the same formations of Asia, especially in the higher latitudes, where the soil which forms their matrix is perennially frozen. Remains of the mammoths have been found in great abundance in the cliffs of frozen mud on the east side of Bering Straits, in Eschholz Bay in Russian America at 66 degrees north latitude, and they have been traced as far south as the states of Ohio, Kentucky, Missouri, and South Carolina. It would thus appear that the primeval elephants formerly ranged over the whole northern hemisphere of the globe. So we quoted that last week, but it just kind of gets us, kind of a look back so we can kind of go forward and have this in context. And there's a footnote that appeared in this particular article in the American Journal of Science. He's talking about an explorer, Hedenstrom. He's referring to this work of this earlier explorer in the early 19th century. And he says in his survey of the Liaochao Islands, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, on the northeastern coast of Siberia, this is what Hedenstrom said. The first of these islands is little more than one mass of these bones. And he's referring to mammoth bones. And that, although the Siberian traders have been in the habit of bringing over large cargoes of them for upwards of 60 years, yet there appears to be no sensible diminution. In other words, the supply of these, even though they've been hauling this stuff out in mass for 60 years, it's like there's been no diminish in the supply of these bones and tusks. Now we come back, we'll jump ahead 10 years to 1857. This appeared in the Quarterly Journal of the Geological Society of London. And a lot of this stuff that we're going to be talking about in the next 5 or 10 minutes is stuff that appeared in the scientific literature and then basically has been forgotten. Never invalidated, never refuted or debunked, just basically ignored and forgotten. This is on the occurrence of bones of mastodon in Chile by W. Bollard, Esquire, Fellow of the Royal Geological Society. On the north side, he's talking about this valley, the hills decline and form there, and there only, a low pass, which some years ago it was proposed to cut for the purpose of draining the lake. So there was this lake right in this valley, and they wanted to drain the lake. So there was a low pass in the hills on one side of the valley or the lake. So they decided they were going to cut a channel so that the lake could drain. So a ditch was commenced from the margin of the lake towards the mountain. And in the progress of the work, at a depth of about 30 feet below the margin of the lake, were found fossil bones. The first animal discovered was very near perfect, with the exception of the head, and at a small distance, another skeleton was found of smaller dimensions. At the width of the drain where the skeletons were found, as the width of the drain where the skeletons were found did not exceed 12 feet, we may conjecture that had the trenches been wider, more remains would have been found. May not herds of these creatures have been destroyed whilst feeding on what at that time was an extended plain? I am inclined to this opinion from having found fossil branches of trees in the same trench with the animals. The Quarterly Journal of the Geological Society of London from 1861. Note on the bone caves of Lunel Viel in Hérault, by Monsieur Marcel de Serres, professor of the Faculty of Sciences at Montpellier. The discovery of he's talking about bone caves near Lunel Viel, or Viel, which you can look up online, LUNEL-VIEL, if you want to locate it. The discovery of the bone caves near Lunel Viel already dates back 38 years. Since then, I have visited some 20 others. Bone caves. The discovery of the large cavern was soon followed by that of several others. We soon comprehended that there was nothing in common between the formation of these cavities and their filling up. In fact, these caves belong to the Tertiary period, whereas the earth with rolled pebbles containing the bones and the excrements as clearly belong to the Drift period. Now, it's interesting that when we go back to the early days of geology, they referred to this material called drift. And drift later became what we now call till. But the reason they called it drift was because they assumed that it was deposited by water flow and not necessarily directly by the glaciers themselves, right? And again, this is these guys looking at this stuff and thinking, okay, this was deposited by water. He says, later we perceived that these rolled pebbles and the fragments of rock were always accompanied by bone remains. And after a great number of observations, we recognized that the presence of the transported materials was essential to the presence of the bones. In fact, where none of the former exist, none of the latter are met with. So that on entering a subterranean cavity which has not been explored, one can decide beforehand whether or not the remains of animals of geological antiquity exist there. It is nevertheless worthwhile to observe that the phenomena of the bone caves is accompanied by the same circumstances all the world over. Finally, the last question which remains is not the least important. It is to learn to what cause ought to be attributed the singular assemblage together of so many bones, often accumulated in such large quantities that they are as plentiful as in a cemetery. I will end this note with an observation of the illustrious physicist so recently lost to science. Humboldt observes that when a phenomena is general and repeated under the same conditions, as has been the case in the filling of the longitudinal, think along the axis of these caves and fissures, filling of the longitudinal and vertical fissures of calcareous rocks like limestones, such a phenomena must have been produced by a cause as general as the effects which group around it. According to this double condition, which is presented in all caves where remains of animals of geological date are found, it is impossible to attribute it to any other cause than to violent inundations. You get it? You've got fissures in the limestone bedrock. You've got caves. You have violent inundations of water sweeping into these fissures and leaving these massive deposits of rolled rocks and boulders, and strewn all throughout these boulders and rocks and gravel are found the fractured and disarticulated skeletal remains of the extinct megafauna.
God,
Yeah,
that's crazy.
Yeah.
That's really sad too.
Well, it is. It is. Hugh Falconer, Fellow of the Royal Society and other distinguished accolades, wrote in the Proceedings of the Geological Society in 1865, that would be the Quarterly Journal of the Geological Society of London. The article was entitled "On the Species of Mastodon and Elephant Occurring in the Fossil State in Great Britain." And he says that the duration allotted to the same species is equally remarkable. Discovered fresh, either in the frozen cliffs or in ice blocks at the mouth of the Lena River in Siberia, it has been traced through its osseous remains, or the remains of its bones, in the superficial gravel beds over nearly the whole of northern and the greater part of Central Europe. So what he's referring to there is that you always are completely finding these remains over and over again in these particular kinds of deposits, these gravel deposits, right? And how do you get these thick layers of gravel deposits? That's where you get, that is the violent inundations that was referred to in the previous quote. Then we have the quick frozen mammoths. Here's one from Geological Magazine published in June 1966. Siberian mammoth, another specimen of the Elephas primigenius, has been discovered in the Bay of Tazutskaya in the government of Tomsk. The flesh, skin, and hair are said to be in a perfect state of preservation. It was discovered accidentally. A native in search of some domestic animals which had strayed perceived a great horn sticking up in the midst of a marshy moor. Can you see that as an opening scene for a really awesome movie?
Oh yeah.
Guy's looking for his lost reindeer, whatever. The marshy moor, probably probably a low mist over it, and he's going along there and he sees this great horn sticking up out of the marshy moor. Can you visualize that?
Yeah.
I would love to find one.
Yeah. Now, there was another geologist who's one of the few catastrophists. You see that in the early days of geology, between about the 1830s and 1850s, most geologists were catastrophists. This included Cuvier and Buckland and Sedgwick and Murchison, and all of these guys were considered the founders of the science of geology. Most of them were catastrophists. But then when you had the work of James Hutton and Playfair and Charles Lyell that came along, they pretty much were the uniformitarianists. And there was a controversy that lasted for about a generation, and the uniformitarianists prevailed. And they were the ones who invoked the concept that the present is the key to the past. And we're coming to that a little further in a few minutes. But the idea there was really a powerful idea, powerful diagnostic idea for understanding features of the past, right? The problem was it became a dogma. And so it became unscientific to talk about forces or phenomena at work that we don't see happening today. And so what you're saying then is if it's only happened within the last few centuries, we're going to limit our conversation, our discussion to those things which we've witnessed since the science of geology has existed in the early 19th century. And we haven't seen anything like what you're talking about in terms of a great catastrophe. You're trying to take us back to biblical literalism. You're trying to take us back to, the flood of Noah and this and that. There were a few important exceptions that made it to the end of the 19th century. And when we get to the turn of the century, we see that that's almost the nadir of catastrophism. Coming into the 20th century, you can find almost no geologists, with only a few exceptions, who are still willing to talk about catastrophes in Earth history. And this was kind of this dry period for the first 2 decades of 20th century until J. Harlen Bretz came along and published his first paper on the megafloods creating the scablands in 1923. Right. And yet it still took another 25 years or more for his theories, his hypothesis of megafloods to be accepted by the geological community. And he was pretty much an outcast for the first couple of decades, going up until the 1940s and 1950s, really until about midway through the 20th century. And what that did was, once geologists had accepted that there'd been this giant flood out there in the Pacific Northwest, that sort of breached the dam a little bit. We could say, okay, well, now there have been these huge floods, but we can explain those by reference to modern processes. And what they did was they turned to modern proglacial lakes or ice-dammed lakes, such as you would find in Iceland or in the Canadian Rockies, in the Himalayas, in Alaska. And they said, well, yeah, okay, so we can see that process at work. So that allows us to fit Bretz's megafloods within the framework of uniformitarianism, right? Never mind that Bretz's floods were typically 1,000 times bigger than any of the largest modern examples. We're just going to invoke the modern examples and extrapolate upwards 3 orders of magnitude. And yeah, now we've got our explanation for those floods. Henry Howarth was a geologist who stood outside the mainstream and unapologetically was a catastrophist. And his work is extremely interesting to read. So I've got a few quotes from him here. And his name, I don't want his name to be lost, because he was an important bridge in the latter part of the 19th century who really presented exhaustive research on catastrophic events in Earth history. He says, this is what he says in 1881 in Geological Magazine. The first thing that seems to follow inevitably from the facts is that, and he's referring now to, by this time there had been numerous finds of these quick frozen mammoths and mega-mammals in the Siberian permafrost, right? With fully articulated skin and flesh, tendons, right? The delicate features, even the orbs of the eyeballs in some cases being preserved, right? So he's addressing that at this point, right? He says the first thing that seems to follow inevitably from the facts is that the bodies, which are now found intact in the Siberian tundras, have remained frozen since they were first entombed. Well, obviously they had to be, because if they were thawed out, they would quickly begin to deteriorate, wouldn't they? Right? We are not dealing here with animal substances deposited in bogs and changed into organic compounds, but of flesh so unchanged that it has all the character of that of animals which have recently died when examined under the microscope, while it is readily eaten by wild animals that live on the tundra. While it is on the one hand clear that the ground in which the bodies are found has been frozen since the carcasses were entombed, it is no less inevitable that when these same carcasses were originally entombed, the ground must have been soft and unfrozen. You cannot thrust soft flesh into hard frozen earth without destroying it. Great carcasses of mammoths with the most delicate tissues, the eyes, the trunk, the feet, beautifully perfect, cannot have been forced down into ground consisting of alternate layers of ice and frozen earth. Right?
Yeah.
Then he goes on in his work, The Mammoth and the Flood, subtitled An Attempt to Confront the Theory of Uniformity with the Facts of Recent Geology.
I like that.
Me too. Published in 1887. It was not until the middle of the 18th century when a trade in fossil ivory was first developed on a considerable scale. This was largely initiated by the stores of mammoth bones discovered in 1750 by the merchant Liachoff. In 1770, this enterprising trader made his way to the island, now bearing his name. 3 years later, he again went northward and discovered the islands of Malloy and Kotelnoy, and I'm probably butchering that, whence he returned with a rich cargo of furs and mammoth bones. These discoveries induced the Russian government in 1775 to send a land surveyor to explore the islands more thoroughly. According to his report, the soil of the first of these islands is almost completely composed of fossil bones, and near it is a mud bank which exposes fresh ones with every storm. This made him conclude that a large deposit lay under the sea there. In one of these islands, he wrote, is a lake with high banks which split open in the summer when the sun melts the ice and disclose heaps of tusks, mammoth bones, and bones of rhinoceroses and buffaloes. The ivory is often as fresh and white as that from Africa. In other parts of the island, bones and tusks are to be seen projecting from the ground. The quantity of ivory, which from this time found its way to the European markets from this source, is almost incredible. Middendorf calculates that altogether not less than 110,000 pounds of fossil ivory go to market every year, representing at least 1,000 individual mammoths. So that during the last 20 years, 20,000 mammoths must have been thus utilized. Nordenskjöld considers Middendorf's calculation as too low rather than too high. Nordenskjöld writes, the steamer alone in which I traveled up the Yenisei River in 1875 carried over 100 tusks. The calculation is, in fact, very much too low. So now you had this steady stream of mammoth ivory coming out of Siberia, being dug up out of these islands in the frozen permafrost. It's being shipped to London, where it's now being dispersed globally to make all kinds of things out of ivory, including piano keys, which was one of the main things that were being made out of mammoth ivory. And I'm going to share here a sketch that somebody did of the London docks, the ivory docks, which was basically, a regular occurrence that
Wow.
Yeah. So now can you imagine, year after year after year, this is what's coming out of the Siberian permafrost. Now, I'm going to ask you, to consider. Human Paleo-Indian hunters with spears, they did this. They were somehow responsible.
Yeah.
And
they just happened to find Siberian islands to deposit all the bones.
Yeah.
They built an island out of the bones, basically.
Yeah.
So let's go on with old Henry Howarth here. The fur hunters hold that when the sea recedes, after a long continuance of easterly winds, a fresh supply of mammoth bones is always washed up on the bank already named, proceeding apparently from some vast store at the bottom of the sea. The valleys of the Yenisei and the Ob are especially rich in such deposits. And Pallas tells us that the mammoth bones which fall out of the cliffs of the Yenisei are so numerous that on decomposing, they form a substance called osteocali. We thus find that the whole northern seaboard of Asia, from Bering Straits to the Ural Mountains, is rich in these remains. And let us do another screen share so that we can start to get, I've managed to come up with a few examples. This is on here's the accumulation of mammoth bones. I think we got, here we are closer up. So these are washing up on the shore. And this is what led these early explorers to think that under the Arctic Ocean, there must be this huge mass of these things. Now, how did that happen? See, now if you assume that, okay, well, sea level was rising, right? But is it rising so fast that these mammoths were so dumb that they couldn't get out of the way? Right? Here's another. Bone counting at the Baralek Mammoth Cemetery in northern Yakutia. Identical deposits are found throughout the Kashmir Peninsula.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just letting you know, Randall, we're at about an hour and 45 minutes.
Well, then I guess we better wrap it up then, huh?
We should wrap it up. Yes,
I did want to tell you, too, that your, what was this guy's name? Litopterna, or I don't know how to pronounce it.
Liakov.
I was trying to say if those were rabbits.
Oh, yeah.
Lipopterns. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's more like a camel-like
horse
three
thing.
Right.
thing with a little
Okay.
short snout like an elephant, but it's real short.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're just getting into this, but there's a whole vast literature from the 19th century, that's parallels what we've been exploring here, and it certainly creates a picture that is not consistent with human predation. You see, human predation did not put those vast stores of bones under the Arctic Ocean. How do you do that? Well, in fact, what we'll show is that there's evidence emerging now of gigantic flash floods washing north across Siberia that would have ultimately washed into yeah. So yeah, we're going to spend another episode or two on this extinction event because it's so important and so interesting. And, there's a few researchers, I think, out there that probably know a lot of the stuff I've been presenting here, but I think that most people are not aware of the specifics here and how we went from looking at this and recognizing that this was obviously catastrophic events, indicative of catastrophic events, to this complete suppression of the idea of catastrophism, but which is now again being overturned because, basically 20th century geology was totally dominated by the uniformity and by the gradualistic paradigm. And, that began to change really. To me, the point of demarcation where that began to shift was 1980. What happened in 1980?
The accepting of the KT event.
Well, I would say more the discovery of the iridium layer at the KT event. I mean, the KT was already accepted as being the mass extinction boundary, but the question was, what was the duration of that boundary and the causes and stuff. And what happened in 1980 was the discovery of the Iridium layer opened the door to the reconsideration of cosmic
impact. Yeah. Okay.
Cosmic impact. Yeah. And we've come a long way since then. And the Cretaceous, the studies of the Cretaceous Tertiary really yield very potent insight into the studies of the Pleistocene Holocene transition. As we're going to see, there are some very important parallels there, including the nanodiamonds. The nanodiamonds that have been found at the Pleistocene Holocene have their closest counterpart with the nanodiamonds found at the Cretaceous Tertiary. There's an example.
Well, I agree with. I love the quotes from the older.
Oh yeah,
researchers. They're great,
aren't they?
It's harder to find that kind of. I mean, like I've always wondered about, like, why do these older people seem to document this and so clearly, and then, like, it's harder to find in the newer literature. It's like they reject this.
When a lot of this was writing, there was no academic discipline of geology per se. What we see coming into the 1890s and into the early 20th century is it becomes part of the academic curriculum. It becomes part of the scientific dogma. And of course, the gradualism of geology perfectly complements the gradualism of Darwinian evolution through natural selection. Yes. See? And so, again, the idea was, well, we're getting away from the old superstitions. We've abandoned the idea of Noah's flood and the biblical account of an earth being only 6,000 years old. And so that's all pre-scientific. We've evolved past that, see? And so when somebody like Bretz comes along and says, okay, there were these gigantic floods almost on a biblical scale, the first knee-jerk response is, oh, you're trying to drag us back to biblical literalism here. We don't want any part of that. So they, in a sense, threw out the baby with the bathwater. But what we have to understand now is that catastrophe has been an intrinsic part of Earth history. Science is demonstrating over and over and over again the reality of catastrophic events, points of discontinuity within the continuum of Earth history. And now that allows us to go back and look at this legacy of inherited traditions and myths and stories and folktales and all of that with a new perspective. And that's why I think it's so valuable and interesting to go back and revisit some of that old stuff.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, you bring up an interesting point about revisiting ancient myths. Having hung with you for the last couple of years, and reading what I have and watching the news, what strikes me about all this is how short a memory we humans have. Mm-hmm. Even for anything catastrophic. We have major floods down the Mississippi Valley one year. We completely forget about it the next year. We have a massive hurricane off the coast of Florida. We completely forget about it. And people go back and build on the coast. Okay. We have massive forest fires in California, and yet people still go back and build out there. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's true. Yeah. And
the human capacity for self-delusion and for forgetting is amazing.
Remember what Merlin said in the Mallory Grail Code. He said, "Is the doom of men that they forget."
Yeah. Precisely. Mm-hmm. And how much of our history, of that ancient history, has been remembered only in these myths and only in these folk tales, the Indian, North American Indian tales, or origin stories. So much has been forgotten. How much of that will we ever be able to recover?
And interestingly, you said so much has been forgotten. I would even say that probably what we have now is probably only a small remnant of the total corpus. When you start thinking about the suppression of knowledge that took place, the destruction of the great libraries, for example. I mean, if you think 400,000 volumes in the Alexandrian library, an equivalent amount in the great library at Carthage, and they're destroyed. I mean, my God, what could have been in those libraries? What might we have learned about ancient history if we had access to those hundreds of thousands of volumes?
Yeah, and all the stuff that was burned in South America too. With the
Yeah, exactly. And and yet the little bit that we've still got is so potent and highly suggestive, as we're going to see, because we're going to get into that.
Yeah.
And then not American, but history historians come up with a timeline that, and suddenly there's a Göbekli Tepe that says, "Oh shit."
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, human cultural history began 10,000 years ago in the plains of Ur. Well, damn, now you've got this site that says, 12,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago. It's, we forget. We forget.
Somewhere in that sense of rebuilding, though, is, well, this just happened, so it's not going to happen for 100 years. It's not going to happen for 1,000 years. This place must be safe now. Let's rebuild. It's not necessarily forgetting, but it's like, well, that's a 1 in a million chance. It's probably safe now.
Yeah. Global floods don't strike in the same place twice.
Which globe are you on?
Hey,
that's a good one.
Well, we're going to show that the floods we're talking about here are not in the fundamentalist sense of some supernatural flood that uniformly drowns the whole planet up to the highest mountain peaks.
Right.
That's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about world-destroying floods. But once you understand the perspective here, if you're a part of a small band of survivors who have survived, say, some of the great floods that we've now thoroughly documented, you're probably going to live out the rest of your life not knowing if there's any other humans on the rest of the planet, because your world, your local and regional world, has been destroyed. If you were somehow managed to luck out and survive living, in the Pacific Northwest at the end of the last ice age, well, yeah, you could easily think or not know, because it'd be just like if what happened 12,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago was to happen again, if we were to have a repeat of that, well, civilization is gone. Most of the human population is gone. And the population that is still left is basically going to be in isolated pockets of survivors.
Right.
Right. And from that perspective, not the planet, but the world has been destroyed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can imagine that after generations of living so isolated, if there was some civilization in Africa that did survive and their technology was sufficient enough to where they brought boats over and they actually ran into these people, there might be really interesting legends left by the people that were isolated. That's about right. Those who came in these vast ships across the sea and brought all kinds of weird knowledge. And
one of the ideas we're going to explore in this series is the idea that there may have been two qualitatively different categories of survivors. On the one hand, you might have people who survived simply because of the luck of the draw. They were in the right place at the right time. For whatever reason, they got spared, right? On the other hand, you might have groups of people that survived because that was part of their agenda. That was part of their plan to survive. And so they put the pieces in place to maximize their probabilities of survival. But of course, then that would suggest the idea of foreknowledge. But interestingly, metaphorically, when we begin to look at the legends, we find all over the planet the same idea. You had these cultural heroes, whether it was Noah or Deucalion or Xisthus or Manu or Utnapishtim. The names are legion, but the stories are all the same. Yeah. What set them apart from their fellow man was that they had foreknowledge.
Right. They were
warned.
How
did they get that foreknowledge? Right. Wow. Exactly. Who warned them?
Who warned them? Yes.
It was the hills.
Yeah. See, now, if you're part of that group, you're presumably going to take steps to maximize your probabilities of survival, and you're probably also going to take steps to preserve as much of the existing order of things, the existing science, technology, information, knowledge, so that you have that as much as possible post-catastrophe when the task is rebuilding civilization.
Yeah, in many of those stories, the being doing the forewarning said that too. Like Manu was told to take the 7 sages that carried all the knowledge of the
yes. So
preservation science.
So part of this is now taking a fresh look at some of these old stories and going, okay, what we're going to do is tease out the essence, the verifiable scientific essence that's maybe over the millennia there has been this accretion of moral traditions and things onto it. Yes, that certainly could be part of it, right? And that would be a natural thing. I mean, the survivors of the aftermath of a great catastrophe may very well be looking at the whole thing within a moral context. Well, all these people got wiped out, and really look at the world today. Look at the chaos in the world. Look at the amount of obsession that people have over things that are of absolutely no consequence whatsoever. The obsession with the minutia and well, I mean, we can get into talking about that, but we say all you have to do is turn on the news every day and you're going to see that. Yeah. Look at what constitutes political discourse today between the two major parties. Yeah. Don't tell me that there isn't a whole degenerate element to society that is now most pronounced ensconced within the political sector.
Yes.
I mean, the whole political discussion down to the sewer level. And so we got to get past that. Yeah. Somehow we got to get back to having people. If we're going to have people in power, they need to be wise. They need to be looking at big picture, not just winning the next election. Or otherwise, we need to think about doing away with the system altogether. Because what it's doing is just throwing one distraction in front of us after another to keep people preoccupied with bullshit. So.
Yep. I agree with that.
I think you do. And I think that a lot of people listening to this also agree with that.
That's right.
Well,
anyone watching
day by day
is not being distracted by the bullshit. That's right.
And tell you the other thing that's going out of this is, we have the internet, and we're linking up. I've gone on, I've lost count, 30 or 40 different podcasts over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And, you guys, look, we met, through basically Darren Grimerica. So Brad and I have known him. When we look at the people who are doing this research and, who are bringing these ideas in this, we don't all agree on every detail. No, obviously not. And we shouldn't necessarily, because that's part of how science works. But still, what we're doing is we're seeing a major shift in our thinking and in the paradigm of our own history, our own story on this planet. And this is what needs to go forward. And I think in the future, what we're going to be seeing is, a network of us like-minded explorers linking up. And the outcome of that could be really, really interesting and positive for the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mike says havoc, you say havoc. We still get along.
That's right.
That's right.
Planetary rescue team. Here we go.
All right. Well, I got to sign off here.
About that time.
Yep. Yeah. It's about that time.
Well, thank you very much, Randall. That was fantastic.
Kick ass again.
Well, we will pick up on this on our next episode. There's a lot more to come, and we'll see what happens. But hopefully we'll get this information out there, and it'll help in a very small way to kind of move this paradigm shift forward.
Yep. All right, everybody can get a hold of us. Kosmographia at gmail.com. Kosmographia1618 @gmail.com. Kosmographia.com is the website. That's the blog where all the posts are. There is going to be more stuff on the website there, but there are links to the Patreon where you can support the show and support Randall's research. What else? What else did we say? Oh, iTunes. Find the podcast on iTunes and give us reviews and give us 5 stars. Everybody. I only want to see 5-star reviews. If you don't want to give 5 stars, get out of here.
Rocket to the top.
Thanks to all of you who have given reviews and who are supporting the show. Thank you so much.
Oh, yes. Second that.
Yeah, so we are still working out on what we're going to be giving to Patreon supporters, but there is going to be special content and stuff like that, so we will be letting you know about that.
Next week, I think I'm going to be doing 2 seals and a walrus, so
All right.
that might be worth checking out. These guys sound like they're good guys. They're ex-Navy SEALs who've really made this paradigm shift. They're working with one of the foremost consciousness explorers and authors, and they're doing a podcast. They reached out to me, so I'm probably going to be doing their podcast next week sometime, which could be good. And yeah, like I said, I think a network is forming here, and we just need to have a big old party somewhere. Like,
hop on the bus, Gus. Come on and travel with us.
There we go.
Good night. See you next week.
Okay. Good night.
Give our
Well done.
Cordier and ice cube trays. We'll never forget.
That's right.
Just scratching the surface, gentlemen. See you next week.
All right.
This is Cosmographia, the Randall Carlson podcast.